actually start. There is a chapter that I was really drawn to, and it's probably because, again, I have issues, and it's the chapter called "Nobody's Perfect," and it talks about perfectionism, which is exactly what you were just, I think, alluding to. Oftentimes we kind of, the real deal's inside, and then what we project to others. But I'd love to, I really wouldn't love to. I really don't want to talk about perfectionism, but if you had a summary in terms of how we could deal with our perfectionist issues, what would you suggest?
I'd say first recognize that you have them, because I know people who are perfectionists. I was in one person's presence yesterday, my dentist of all people, who's a perfectionist.
We
And
want your dentist to be a perfectionist.
well, you do. I mean, you absolutely do. But I don't think she recognizes that she sometimes is pushing it just a little bit further than it needs to be, and doesn't know how to kind of relax a little bit. Maybe it's just because she's at work, but just in general, I think the first step is to know that you may have an issue with perfectionism. You may not. There's a continuum. There are people who, it's good enough. Then there are people, it'll never be good enough. So there's a long range of possibilities of where you could put yourself on that range. And I think when you find that your striving for perfectionism is getting in the way of relationships, of feeling contentment during your day, feeling satisfaction with what you're doing, feeling like, yes, I can put a period on this now and let it go. If you can do that, that's fine. That's what I would call functional perfectionism, and paying attention to details and doing the best that you can. It becomes a problem when it goes a step further, that nothing is ever perfect, and if something happens, it's someone else's fault, when actually internally you're feeling like it's your fault. So when there are issues like that come up, and of course the kosha that works best with that is Vijnanamaya kosha. You start there, and because once you once the mind recognizes that this may be a problem and I should kind of think about it before you jump to solutions, that's where my suggestion is, why are you exhibiting this behavior? What is it sourced from? Where did it come from? Did it come from something that happened to you in your childhood? Was it layered on you because you feel you have to be better than in order to be accepted as good enough? There's tons of reasons. And I certainly figured out what mine were. And it was growing up Black and female, and being pushed by my family. You have to be better than in order to be accepted as good enough. So that was a struggle. And when you figure that out, it's like, oh, okay. So now I have taken that. Did Deborah and I do a comedy routine when you were at Kripalu?
You did a little, but it was only a dabble. Do you have one for us?
Oh, I don't have it off the top of my head, but basically it's in that chapter on perfectionism, because I did a stand-up. I actually did. That was on my bucket list of things I wanted to do before I kicked the bucket. And it was to do a stand-up comedy routine. So I took the stuff in that chapter on perfectionism, which is almost what's in the chapter, and I had to memorize it. And I actually stood up in front of an audience and delivered it for 10 minutes. It was like, oh, but yeah, so I'm in recovery. And it's possible.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, well, you segued into Vijnanamaya kosha. So let's maybe reel it back just a little bit for those that are listening and are not familiar with the koshas.
Okay. Yeah.
Could you give just a simple summary definition of the
Yes.
koshas? Yeah.
Um, we're all pretty much familiar with the Western, I think, mind body model and how Western medicine is beginning to understand that the mind and the body are connected and send signals back and forth, and one affects the other. The koshas come from a 3,000-year-old Vedanta text called the Upanishads, the Taittiriya Upanishad, to be particular. And there are a series of verses in there, and those 5 verses describe the koshas. I don't have them memorized, but each one describes one of the koshas. So it says that as a human being, we have 5 of these layers or treasures or sheaths, or sometimes people visualize them as Russian dolls, one stuffed inside of the other. What we have to understand, though, is that they're not actually separate. We separate them so that we can talk about them, because language is very limiting. But, and even though we might work on one, we are working on all of them at the same time. So I was at my teacher, Joseph LePage, was scheduled to do a workshop on high blood pressure at Kripalu one year. And I got an email from him that asked me if I could take his place. I was like, what? I said, why? Why? What happened? He said, my travel agent booked me. They were supposed to uh, book him for Albany, New York, and then Kripalu was going to go pick him up and drive him to Kripalu. They booked him to Albany, Georgia.
Oh, fun.
Oh, fun. So he was in Georgia, and there was no way he was going to get back. So I said, oh, send me your slides. I'll do the best
Yeah.
I can. So while I was delivering the workshop, and I was talking about the koshas because I learned them from Joseph, and everything, frankly, I mean, almost everything I talk about relates right back to the koshas and how they play a very strong part in almost every condition, every experience we have. And so generally I learned that if we're going to work with the koshas with students or clients, it's easiest to start with the physical body, because there are 5. I should explain that first. There's our physical body. Then there's our breath and energy, which are intertwined, and they work in the body together at the same time. When you breathe in energy. Then there is mind, our thoughts, our emotions, habits, and behaviors. Then there is the witness, which is also called intuitive wisdom. And that's where we can dip into our subconscious and unconscious and sometimes pull out the reasons why we think about something in the way we think about it, or why we have a habit. Where did it come from? That's what I was alluding to before. And then there's bliss, which is just basically what brings you joy. Some people say it's spiritual transformation, but in general, I just say what brings you the most joy in life. And it could be more than one thing. And it could be religious or spiritual or just a great hobby or chocolate or something like that.
Right.
But anyway, so I was talking about the 5 koshas and how you can look at the koshas and take any situation, any health condition, and you can run it through these 5 levels and get a slightly different understanding, so that you have a better idea of how to deal with the person in front of you, even if they have no clue about the koshas and aren't even interested. So anyway, I was relaying it from physical, energy, mind, witness, and bliss. And someone in the audience raised their hand and they said, well, I was taught that we start with bliss because when you look at Ayurveda or or Samkhya or any of the ancient philosophies, everything starts on the energetic, spiritual, higher level, and then vibrates and works its way down until it hits the physical. And I said, it's fine. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're able to figure out how to take that wonderful model and work with the person or students or group of people that are in front of you. And I was telling some other folks in another program that when I learned this from Joseph, it was, oh yeah, that makes sense. I've got it up here. Now, how am I supposed to go home and use that information in the classes I teach? Because the people I teach, they're not interested in Sanskrit. They're not interested in 3,000-year-old traditional texts. How do I translate this?
Mm.
And it took, and I went looking for books because, I'm a reader. So, but all I could find at that time, and this was like 1996, all I could find was a pamphlet that was totally not relatable. A
Oh.
few years ago, BKS Iyengar finally came out with a book called Light on Life. It explains the koshas in more detail, but it's all tied up with Sanskrit and all the other models that the traditional yoga texts use. And I was like, I want something that I can understand. And so it took me almost a year to get the information from up here into my cells. And so now it's second nature. I walk into a class. Fortunately, I have 2 live classes at the moment. They are masked and socially distanced, but they've been working fine. And I walk in and I have to take stock of who's here, who's in a chair, who's on a mat, who's got back issues, who's dealing with something else, who's had stress because of something that happened in their family. And I have to like translate that into the class that I'm presenting.
Mm.
And when I do that, so I try to include something from each of those 5 koshas in the class, starting from a body scan, a breath scan, scanning what's going on in the mind before we even get started. And then hopefully by the end of the class, they've been, the witness is up a little bit more. And so when they go into relaxation, hopefully it's bliss. So
Mm.
that's kind of the translation I use when I'm teaching. And that's kind of why I wrote the book.
Good. It's an excellent, I was gonna say summary.